From the time that we are just getting started in the workforce, the word retirement keeps popping up for us time and time and time again. And we never actually get to talk about what happens when we get to that point. Well, today's guest on the Power to Pivot podcast is Wendy Leggett, and she is here to talk with us. We're talking about retirement today. Wendy, thanks for coming on the show.
Oh, my pleasure. It's great to be here, and thanks for having me, Elizabeth.
So you are coming at retirement in terms of how do you live through that phase of your life with a sense of fulfillment, and what does that look like when you get to that stage, right? Like, we're not talking about financial planning, we're talking about fulfillment planning for retirement.
Love that. Yes. Yeah, that's so true. Yeah. And I think as you're mentioning, people as we grow up, we hear that word, whether or not it's something we plan to do or that it feels way in the future, we get closer and closer to it. And so if we aren't planful about it, if we don't think beyond the financials, because there's so much focus on that, as we both know, and rightfully so, it's important. But if that's all that we look at, well, we're bringing our whole selves into retirement. And so when you ask that question, what does that look like? That looks like being able to transition from our work, where we had a very strong sense of identity, more than likely, and a baked in feeling around purpose and a lot of connection because of our coworkers and our clients or whatever comprise that workplace. And that we're able to then transition, bringing those things with us in a different way. And yet still feeling that we matter, feeling like when we get up in the morning that we have a why, that we have a reason to get out of bed, that we are making a contribution to ourselves and to those we love and to our community and hopefully to the world. There's just so much more that we can give. And so that's what that looks like for me. And as I navigate that with my clients.
I love that, because we're not saying life is over. Like, you're far, just because you hit the age where you're no longer in a traditional, maybe corporate or 9 to 5 job, life doesn't end. There's so much more.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And I always liken it to the next chapter in a book. It's not a new chapter. We're bringing so much with us. But at the same time, if we don't recognize what we want to leave behind and what we really want to focus on and have that vision, then we can start to feel like one client of mine said, lost in the desert, just kind of unmoored and kind of wondering like what's next. Or you get into that honeymoon phase where it's like, wow, now I travel and leisure and endless weekends and my to-do list and my bucket list. But we know studies show that within 6 months to 2 years, that honeymoon phase wears off. And then people are left with either that feeling of Groundhog's Day, that feeling of loss that you're speaking to, or that feeling of, is this all there is?
Is that what brings sort of the fear of the discussion of retirement? Like, I know for me, it's always been something that I've known is coming, right? Like, you know it's going to happen, but it's almost uncomfortable to think about that.
Yes. Yeah.
How do you help clients like reframe to get through that discomfort of planning for that phase and what comes next? Because I think that's the first piece of it, is just getting over that. It's almost like an acceptance of, this is the stage of life that you're in, and you can do it with still fun and vitality, but you have to get to that point of acceptance first.
Yeah, I mean, I think acceptance is a great word. I think that fear is also a very accurate word, and I think both of those can be greatly helped with planning, with an awareness going in. I speak about, instead of having an idealistic view or a pessimistic view. So idealistic being, like I said, endless weekends, travel, leisure, or pessimistic, one foot into the grave. It's all about loss. It's all about aging. Instead, I look at that realistic optimism and that resilient optimism. And that comes with planning. That comes in with coming in with eyes wide open about what's happening for me as I leave my career. How am I feeling about that? And then also, and what am I retiring to? and what am I retiring with? So oftentimes I feel as though fear, if we really sit in that place and say, well, where's the fear coming from? What am I afraid of? And we can kind of excavate that. We can bring it into the light and then we can deal with it. But if we just leave it pushed down and we just think, oh my goodness, retirement is looming large for me. Yes, it's understandable that people feel stuck, they feel confused, they feel in denial, resignation, any number of difficult emotions. And so that's a lot of the work that I do is I call it taking aim on retirement, heightening our awareness, setting our intention, which is about getting that plan and getting that vision, and then getting into movement, getting into action, having these ideas, but not sitting with it or planning ad infinitum, but instead just getting on with it and experimenting and trying things out. So
I love that you put it that way, like getting on with it. Well, maybe it's here, maybe it's coming, you just want to plan, but getting on with it, keep the momentum going, and then experimenting. Like you're in a new stage of life where you can sort of reinvent. Like there's this I'm like waving my pen like I'm stirring a pot, but like you can almost, like you're crafting a new version, the next version of you.
yeah, I talk about a retirement by design, not default. And so I think we're connecting on that same thing. It's that I call it you being the CEO of you. This is your life now. You get to take charge. But when you take charge, you also take accountability for your choices. You also are part of that. And so I think but that's a big ask if people don't have the tools or they don't have the answers to the questions. So that's where I'm able to be that guide, is that there is a pathway. I take people through a roadmap, but more importantly than that, I ask the questions so that they can really reflect on what's important to them or what's getting in their way and what's needed to move forward.
Do you think, you said an important word, accountability?
Hmm.
Do you think that in those prior years, it's easier to shift sort of, I want to say the blame, but like onto that 9 to 5 and onto the corporate? Like, is that where that accountability now needs to shift onto you? Like, tell me more about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it does kind of connect with this idea of being the CEO of you, being the leader of you. Whereas when we've been in career, and even if you're a business owner, let's say, there are still forces that you have to deal with that are out of your control. And now, when you're moving into retirement, and again, there are going to be a number of things that are out of your control, but there's a lot within your control and your sphere of influence. So, really stepping into that. But the way to step into it is to be aware at the very forefront that these are my choices. And we know that even when we don't make a decision, we're making a decision. So I feel very strongly about not abdicating those choices and really, taking that ownership. I do want to kind of circle back to the fact that I do not advocate for retiring if that's not what someone wants. I advocate for really deciding, what does retirement mean to you? How do you define retirement? And then if that's then your next step, then stepping into it fully. And like you said, taking that accountability. And that's a really important piece in my mind, because I've had clients come to me to plan out retirement. And as we've been working through our time together, it becomes very clear to me that they're not wholeheartedly wanting to retire. Maybe they've had pressure from family or friends. Maybe they've just assumed that at a certain age you retire. And so for some of them, they've decided to not retire because as we work together, they see that they have balance in their life. Their work is fulfilling. They feel as though they're pursuing things outside of work. And so, yet they were going into retirement by default. They were abdicating that decision because of social pressure or because of family or friends and things like that.
Wow.
Yeah.
So that's actually something that hadn't even occurred to me, like the social pressure of going into retirement.
Yeah. That like all of your friends have maybe retired, or at your company, it's known that when you're 62, you retire, or any number of other factors there. And I recognize that I'm not addressing those that are not choosing to retire, but their company has severed, ties with them or something like that. And so I recognize then that's a different kind of circumstance than what I'm speaking to. In all cases, though, going in with that mindset about the possibilities rather than the pitfalls, and the opportunities rather than the obstacles, not overlooking them, addressing them, and then stepping into them.
Let's talk about what some of those possibilities look like, because I think let's paint that picture. What can it look like for someone who is at that stage where they know they want to take that step back out of the workforce, they want to retire?
Yeah.
What are those possibilities?
I mean, it's kind of the oyster in the world, I mean, everything's available to you. So what I do in my work with people is really talk about, we look at purpose, we look at values, we look at your sense of identity and what you hold to be important. I know I'm rattling all that off, so let me deconstruct a little. Is that first we start with what does retirement mean to you? How do you define it? And so for some, it may be, gosh, now I have this freedom to travel, or now I have this ability to give more of my time to my family or my friends, or now I have this chance because I do feel as though the financial piece isn't as important to me or critical for me, that I can springboard off of my capabilities around being a team leader, and now become a mentor in a nonprofit, or a mentor in some vocation that's important to me. I've had some clients that say, I just want to go work at Disneyland. I just want to go work in our area. We have, I'm in California, we have like the Richard Nixon Library. So being a docent there. So it's really, it can be any and everything. But it really starts with, again, making those choices that serve you, because we know that when we springboard from a place that's meaningful to us, then not only do we contribute to ourselves, but we contribute to those that we love, to our community, to our world. And so I do really look at what does feel purposeful. We know that that was baked into our work. And oftentimes we don't think about it, that achievement or those goals or that structure is all baked in. And now we've stepped out of it. We can feel like we're unmoored. We can feel like we're, like, where do we go from here? So really then pulling that back together and saying, okay, well, this is where I stand and this is where I want to go. And then taking those steps to get there. So I shared a lot, but does that kind of help a little?
Yeah, that's perfect. I'm curious too, like, because you're talking about values. It's one of the things you mentioned in this process. So how often do you see your clients come in and you're talking about values, and they realize that maybe what they thought was their value has changed over the course of their career? Like, does that happen, and how do you help them through that process?
Yeah, I think oftentimes when I'm working with people, they really haven't sat and reflected and really committed to their values. And of course, values can change over time, but that's a part of our work together, is really going in and doing that assessment around, getting more granular around our values, so that, because we know that when we springboard off of our values into our actions, that we are more committed and we do feel more aligned. So to your point, yes, I've had people who really thought, okay, when I go into retirement, what I value is this idea of freedom and being able to fish and golf and travel. And yet when they really stop and really absorb all of it and say, what is meaningful, what does feel of value to me, that may be, yes, a piece part of it, but that's not the driving factor. So they may have started planning for retirement with all of that in mind, and yet then they see, but I really do want to contribute in my faith, or I really do want to give more to, like I said, my family, or any number of other things. So, and I want to say too, that also that value around money can be really a high priority, especially because so often when we're planning for retirement, we do think about, need to consider finances. But yet, if we have our values so closely attached to that, that can also kind of put a pall over our retirement experience. That can also make it feel like, well, then I don't have enough money to do this. We stop looking at the possibilities. I work with a lot of financial planners, and that's one of the biggest issues of concern with their clients is their clients don't want to spend the money, even though their financial planner has mapped out for them and shown them you've contributed in these ways, you can afford this. But there is that feeling of scarcity. So I think that that whole idea of reframe and coming in and saying, are we coming from a place of lack or a place of abundance? Are we coming in with so much significance around this, or are we looking at it as lightness? So for your listeners who might not know that terminology, reframe, and it is something we use in the coaching world, and it's when we have a viewpoint or a perspective that's skewed to one way, and how can we look in it in a different way that maybe moves us from that difficult into that more positive, more expansive.
I appreciate that. Noticed almost like a fear of losing control, because as you're describing the aspect of working with that financial planner, and there's, it's all mapped out, and yes, you can afford, do you feel that there's this like feeling of a loss of control over maybe their life when they get to that point, because and you mentioned the word structure, like, does that come with it?
Yeah, you've got several great questions in there. So I think the first piece is that idea that it can be control and it can be that unknown. So like with a financial planner, they can say, yes, you're in great shape, but there's a lot that happens in the world that none of us have control over, to your point. And that then, leads to this feeling of unknown and uncertainty. And so it's better to pull back. So we want to come in, like I said before, with that balance, that realistic optimism, rather than being one end on the spectrum or the other. And of course, like we said too, it's your choice. You have to be accountable. So you're going to do your due diligence. You're going to have your trusted advisors, whether it's a financial planner or you're doing that personally or whatever resources you use. But ultimately, yeah, the buck stops with us, and we need to make those conscious decisions. And then I think too that there's this idea that we need to really just look at what we're bringing with us and have that trust and have that faith in ourselves, and recognize that life has its twists and turns. But if we have this belief in ourselves, and you speak about pivot, and we recognize that we're staying open to the possibilities, and we may need to shift, and things may change, but having that trust and belief in ourselves. And I think that comes from having this vision and having this commitment and clarity, and also then being able to have some kind of structure. And I'm not talking about routine, because I think routine gets to that Groundhog's Day, hamster wheel, same old, same old. But structure, human beings, we tend to deal best with some kind of guardrails, with some sorts of boundaries. So if we understand how we best operate in a day, are you a planner? Are you a free-flowing person? Do you like to have certain things in the course of the day? Do you like to have it all mapped out? Whatever it is. But again, really taking that time to get true to yourself and say, this is how I best operate. This is what works for me. And as you move along, then audit it and pivot if it's not coming together, not feeling good.
Have you ever had someone come to you as you're asking these questions and them not know? Because like I'm thinking about it and I'm going, I don't know that I've ever, until a certain point in my life, defined what that meant, defined what worked and how I operated.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And that's exactly the work that I do. We take it step by step. I have stepping stones. We don't want to leap to the end. Like I wouldn't meet with somebody and say, okay, what's your plan? No, we're taking so we start off with, how do you define retirement? What's meaningful for you? What are you envisioning? And you may not know, but you may know what you don't want. Or you may have little glimpses, or I have a lot that come in with their to-do lists and their bucket lists and things. And so that's our starting point. But then we start to look at it more closely. So one of the exercises, and at the end, we'll chat about something that I'd love to offer to your listeners, which is a retirement readiness mini workbook. But in it is one of the exercises is the no regrets retirement, and envisioning that first day and that first week, that ideal retirement, and mapping it all out. And you start to see very clearly, okay, for some, this, I don't know. I've never thought about it. So then it takes some more thinking. Or, then we work further and then you go back and readdress it. But for others, it'll start to be, wow, I thought my days were going to be filled, but now I see a lot of gaps. Or, wow, my dance card's really full. And then I might be challenging, what is it about needing that dance card to be so full? Because I have had clients that have this busyness factor, and they take all of that energy and that structure and that routine from work and those expectations, and they plop it right into their retirement. And that's why I think in part we've seen the unretirement that happened. You're probably acquainted when people said, hey, this wasn't what I expected, I'm going to go back to work. And that's kind of heartbreaking to me, because if people really anticipated and worked toward that retirement and made that decision, and then they undo it, I would really want us to take pause and say, well, what's not matching up for you? What were your expectations? What else is possible? And yes, if you want to go back to work for reasons that you're really clear about, then I'm all for it. Not that it's my decision anyway, but if it's really not because you want to go back to work, but you just have, you're just feeling resigned about what your life was looking like, or you got so uncomfortable, or that fear that you brought up before, well, then we want to take a closer look. So I know I didn't, speak as closely to your question, which was such an excellent one, which is, how do I even answer these questions? But that's where working with someone like me, and it's not a really long process. I do work with people over quite a number of sessions, but it's not like I'm going to be in your back pocket for the rest of your life unless you want me to be. It's just giving you some of those stepping stones, some of those questions. And if someone has difficulty answering one, then we dig a little bit deeper and say, what is it about that question that's, kind of elusive for you? Or what is it about that question that brings you this difficult emotion, or any number of things? Yeah.
I love the way you did answer it. And I love that you are highlighting the fact that you don't have to go through this process alone.
Mm.
To have someone holding your hand as you're walking this path that can be really scary and uncomfortable, you're kind of getting yourself into a more stable place, and so you're there to support through that process. I think that's a really key point, because
Yeah.
when we get there, I'd imagine it can be almost a lonely feeling, and so you're like, no, I'm here, I got you, we can do this
Yes.
together.
Yeah. And I think that's where, if you ask somebody, how's retirement? Generally, they're going to say, it's fantastic. It's great. I'm having the best time. I've been doing this, that, and the other. But studies tell us, research shows that 1 in 3 struggle in retirement. So out of the 3 people you ask, and it's probably underreported, at least one of them is having difficulties. But society tells us that this is the best time of your life. It's the golden years. So who's going to raise their hand and say, I'm struggling, I'm having a difficult time? And that is something that so often when I start working with someone, those struggles, those challenges surface very quickly, and I'm able to normalize it and say, you are not alone. And this is a whole new chapter. Like when we think about when we plan from high school to college or career, or buying a home, or getting married, or any number of big milestones in our lives, there was a template for it. There was a focus on it. And it wasn't just the financial. If somebody, let's say, was going to college, they had to have the financial wherewithal, but they looked at a lot of other factors when they made that decision. Well, it's the same with retirement. And yet, again, the preponderance of the focus is on the financial piece. And so it's understandable that people think, oh, should be able to do this alone. It's a do it yourself. What's so difficult about travel or having, no work and all the freedom? Well, no, people do start to feel that loss of identity, that loss of feeling purposeful, that loss of connection. Um, so, so all of those things I'm able to help with and more. I want to highlight too that this is a transition. It's a major life event. There was work done by Holmes Rave about the most stressful life events, and they cited 43 of them. Retirement came in as number 10.
Wow.
As number 10. And so that doesn't mean that it's not anticipatory, that it's not exciting, but it's stressful. And so we want to get at that stress so that we can springboard off of it in a way that's energetic, as opposed to something that's debilitating, so that we can look at how we can move forward instead of starting to feel, oh my goodness, I have nowhere to go. There is this time abundance that's baked into retirement. We feel like, oh, we have all this endless time. And yet I feel so strongly that, all we're promised is this present moment. And so if we don't really look at, yes, we have this a lot of time, but how do we want to use it in a way that's, focused on the things most important to us, then it can start to be that we're filling time rather fulfilling our time. There's been a lot of work that's been done around the power of transitions. I wasn't aware of this. So through all my career steps, because I was in corporate leadership for quite a long time, I didn't really look at the power of transitions. I looked at that external change, but there's this internal piece, what's going on inside of us and the things that we need and the things that we want to bring with us and we need to leave behind so that we set those great patterns and habits that serve us, that are so vitally important in this transition. So William Bridges is prolific around his work on transitions. And what he says is that we start with the ending. We start with closure to that career in the case of retirement. We really look at, okay, what has this meant to me? And maybe we have rituals like going away, retirement parties or whatever that may be, or memorializing. But then we put a period or we put an exclamation mark around that chapter. And then we look at not the new beginning yet, but now we move into what he calls the neutral zone. And this is that time. And you kind of spoke to it about the thinking about, well, what do I want? And a lot of different emotions can come up: feeling stuck, feeling denial, feeling resigned, feeling unsure, feeling lost. But really, then that's where I really am able to help, is like, what are all those feelings? Where are they coming from? What are they meaning to you? What would be supportive of you? And so then we start to look at, then what would that retirement, what could it look like for you? And like we talked about before, taking little steps and experimenting and trying things out, because oftentimes people will jump right into that new beginning and they'll say, I'm going to take care of the grandkids every day of the week, or I'm going to be volunteering at this place 40 hours a week. And so they've jumped into it. And again, they can start to feel resigned or feel resentful because they didn't really get to try it out a little bit.
I want to back up for a second because I want to make sure we get to the retirement readiness workbook. I think, I know you mentioned it just really quick, but can you share a little bit more about that, and then where people can get it?
Yeah, well, it'd be great if in the show notes you put a link, because that's where people, if for anyone listening and interested, if you click on that link, then it will come to me and I'll send you the workbook. And in that workbook, I do speak to this idea of taking aims: awareness, intention, moving. And so I kind of break it down. As I mentioned earlier, I shared that 3-page no regrets retirement, where you envision that first week and day, etc. But then the second part of it is you also think, okay, now I don't have that time abundance. I now only have 5 years. And so stepping through what would bubble up as your priorities are the most important things. And then finally, in that 3-page, it's if you had no time left, would you have regrets? What would you have wished that you did? Because now you have that chance to reverse engineer. Now you have that chance to reflect at the end of my days, what would be most important to me? and you can start to build that in now. I talk about a retirement runway, so even before we've retired. And I hope that at whatever age or life stage any of you listening are at, is that you do have some takeaways here. You think about what will feel purposeful to me outside of work, and what are the things that are going to be important to me as a lifelong, and start to take little steps instead of thinking, oh, when I retire, I'll get healthy, or oh, when I retire, then I'll be able to travel. What are those little steps that you can take now, so that you're really having that runway and those good habits and that commitment to yourself that goes beyond career? Also in that retirement workbook, then it does kind of help you bubble up what's your perspective about retiring and what are you grateful for? Because we know that when we're really present and realizing what we have in our life, that oftentimes then that sense of loss is really diminished or dissipated. So again, it'll be in the show notes, a link. And then also people can always reach out on my website, and I can share that at the end too.
Great. Yes, and we'll make sure that gets linked as well. I want to ask, like, at what point, because you have a sales and business development background,
Yes.
at what point did you decide to take your step away from that and shift into this work?
For me, yes, I was in corporate leadership, Fortune 50 to franchises to fashion, for most of my career, about 25 years. Love the connection with clients, love the connection with my team members and helping elevate their capabilities, and love meeting goals and achieving sales and service numbers. But the last position that I was in, and I loved it, I was working for a couple who owned a number of franchises. So I was their director of sales. And we really were hitting it out of the ballpark. I mean, we did some amazing things. I won't take up everybody's time with that. And in hindsight, that was probably like almost the worst thing, because the company then was so viable to sell that they decided to do that. And so then the new owner that came in had such a different philosophy about the business. And I tried every which way to kind of try to, shift myself or shift my team members, or change my clients' expectations, or really try to go back to him and try to shift his. But when the day is done, it was his business. I could not face my clients carrying forward a message that didn't align with my values, and I couldn't ask that of my team members. So for me, it ended up being a very painful decision that I kind of didn't allow for right away, because I'm a problem solver and a fixer, and I thought, oh, I can make this work. But ultimately, then I just had to, when things are not in alignment with your belief system and your values, if we're listening, then we can find another way. So I decided to step away and thought, well, do I go back into another sales opportunity, or is this a chance for me to look at something else? And I thought, I want to bring myself forward more. I was always promoting a product or service, but I really wanted to bring more of myself forward. So I looked into things. I discovered coaching. I went back to school. I got my professional certified coaching credentials. And then I went further, because I started out as a business coach, because that's what I knew. But very quickly, I started to see, there are people that are in that close to retirement age really struggling. And I discovered retirement life coaching, went back and got several additional credentials, as well as one in positive intelligence, which is about really being able to shift our mind from that survivor brain into a really positive approach to life, and being able to see those negative emotions, understand them, that they're signals that, oops, something's wrong here, and needs more attention, and then shift it into something that's more supportive of us. Yeah, and I just have to say that it's so, like, to challenge yourself and move out of that comfort zone into that discomfort area that wasn't so far afield, but all the same is so invigorating. It's so life affirming. And so I would really underscore that for anyone listening, that if you, like you said, if you feel like you're not able to walk in integrity and you're not able to bring your best self forward, being able to stop and think, and maybe it's not making a change in career, but maybe it's making a little change in a habit that you have, or really stepping more into a relationship or whatever, there's any number of things, but just not phoning it in, not just staying on autopilot, not just saying, well, this is how it has to be. Because at every age, and I'm talking about retirement being the CEO of you, but we're all the leaders of ourselves all through our lives. And the more
Yes.
that we step into that accountability and knowing that we're at choice, I think is really, really critical.
Before we wrap up today, something that I want to talk about really briefly is, do you feel like we've made progress towards changing the stereotypes about retirement? Like, and or is there still work to do?
I do a lot of reading about pro-aging, and I feel as though aging and retirement kind of are, they go hand in hand, they're interwoven. And so, because by and large, the majority of people that are retiring are older adults. And so I think that when we talk about progress around retirement, I think that there are steps that are being taken toward more of this pro-aging stance. And also this recognition that we do have so much more to give. The retirement age is typically traditionally thought 62, 65. Well, then we see that on average, and hopefully for everyone, that we have 20 or 30 more years to live. That means a third of our life. And so if we start to look at it, that retiring is retiring, and really the word should be retired. It just does not fit in our vocabulary any longer, but it's a shared language for us. So when you ask the question, are things moving in a better direction? Yes, there's such a large number in the baby boomer generation who are retiring. They want more. They see that it can be more, that they can give more. So yes, I feel like there are steps forward. But aging is thought of as one of those kind of unrecognized prejudices, and I think that at early ages we start to see the negatives about aging, and so that's just sort of embedded in our culture, in our mindset. And so it's important that we shift that view as well, because we know that if we look at aging in a negative way, then we're going to be shortening our own lifespan. There's a lot of research around that. And so we want to go in with that recognition that we do, like you said, still have so much more to give, and that there are all these opportunities. And it's up to us to step into it and make those choices.
I think it makes it really challenging. The way you answered that was perfect, because I think about the messages we get about aging and getting older from the time we're young, quote unquote, right?
Yeah.
And you don't have to think about it in those terms. Anti-aging is a big buzzword, especially in the beauty industry. And it almost perpetuates the cycle of fear about getting to that stage of life, that I think it opens us up as a society to resisting it more.
Yes, and that's where I'm trying to change my vocabulary. And that's why I use
I
pro-aging,
love that.
anti-aging. That's why I try to use older adults instead of any number of things. I mean, my awareness, I need to continue to educate myself. Also, like, oh, you look good for your age, or I would have never guessed, any of those kinds of things. Just speak to that, whether it's a backhanded compliment or it's that negative self-talk. And most of it is the self-talk. And so I've had clients say, well, I'm invisible, and I feel invisible. And I say, well, are you invisible? I mean, because if we think that we're invisible to people, that is probably what we're projecting. And I'm not trying to say, toxic positivity around it, but we have to lead with that. We have to feel empowered to do it. Somebody gave that, instead of empowered, it's like empower. Yeah, I love that
I
too.
love
Yeah.
that.
Words to me are just so important. And so, but it's just continuously looking at ourselves and what we're saying to ourselves, what we're saying to others, because we're all going to get old, hopefully. And so how do we define it? How do we step into it? How do we shed the get old? It's a number thing, or fighting it if you're young and you're just feeling old, then there's a struggle there. What is that about?
Yeah.
Uh, yeah.
Wendy, there's so much more that we could talk about regarding this. We might have to have you back on the show.
Oh, I
Um,
love it. Yeah.
Remind us again, where can we get the retirement readiness workbook? Where can people connect with you?
Oh, I appreciate that. So the name of my company is Conflux Retirement Coaching, and that's CONFLUX. So Conflux Retirement Coaching. So people can go to my website, confluxretirementcoaching.com. They can email me at wendy@confluxretirementcoaching.com. If you click on the show notes, then that will lead you to the retirement readiness workbook. And in that, then I offer a complimentary laser focus coaching session for anybody that is feeling like, wow, where do I go from here, or overwhelmed with it, or so excited about it and wants to share that too. And especially when you go through the workbook, then getting in contact with me and let's go over what your findings were. So
I love it. Thank you. Yes, we will put all the links in the show notes. Everybody make sure you connect with Wendy. Thank you for the work that you're doing, and thank you for coming on today.
Oh, it was so enjoyable. And I really appreciate your thoughtful questions. It's obvious you really care about your listeners and wanting them to be able to pivot with purpose. And so I do really appreciate that. Thank you.
We're going to wrap up the way we do every episode. You are never stuck. You are never lost, and you are never, ever alone. At any given moment, you can use your power to pivot, make a new choice, and start again. We'll talk with everyone on the next episode.